I'm Shane Morris with the Colson Center for Christian Worldview. Do the hypocrisies and failings of Christians invalidate Christianity? Well, of course not, despite what the media or the waves of "I was a former evangelical" narratives would have us believe. Today, John Stonestreet welcomes Mary Jo Sharp, author of the new book, Why I Still Believe, a former atheist's reckoning with the bad reputation Christians give a good God. Here's John Stonestreet with Mary Jo Sharp, assistant professor of apologetics at Houston Baptist University and the founder and director of Confident Christianity Apologetics.
Welcome to the Breakpoint Podcast. I've said this a lot. One of the easiest ways to get an article published in a major media outlet like the USA Today or CNN or something like that is to kind of tell the story of your deconversion. I was once an evangelical, but Trump, or I was once an evangelical, but purity culture, or I was once an evangelical, but, da. And what happens when those stories get told that way is that, first of all, there's this impression that really there's this mass deconversion from evangelical Christianity, which the numbers really don't bear out. That's the first thing. The second thing is that there's no other stories, right, of folks that are, experiencing the same sort of, hypocrisy or frustration with the church, but actually, kind of sticking to it. That's why I'm excited to have as a guest today on the Breakpoint Podcast, my friend Mary Jo Sharp. She is a former atheist who came to faith, and we're going to talk a little bit about that, but also having dealt with kind of the frustrations of, the things that kind of sometimes lead people away from Christian faith. She is a Christian from the Pacific Northwest, which puts her in the category of unicorn right off the bat. Right, Mary Jo?
Yeah, very different culture up here.
Oh, come on. You're going to have to let me poke a little bit of fun at that. But Mary Jo is an assistant professor of apologetics at Houston Baptist University, the founder and director of Confident Christianity Apologetics, and an author of several books, but her latest one, which we're going to talk about, Why I Still Believe, a former atheist reckoning with the bad reputation that Christians give a good God. Mary Jo, it's great to have you on the Breakpoint Podcast.
Hey, John. Thanks for inviting me on.
So the deconversion narratives are really famous, right? I mean, it's either a deconversion from Christianity itself or a deconversion from a particular kind of moral position, usually having to do with, the LGBT issues, right? I used to believe this, but now I believe this. And this seems to be kind of a big motivation of people. And again, I think it's an easy way to get a whole lot of things published. But is kind of that reality, the kind of the popularity of deconversion narratives, was that one of the things that kind of motivated you to want to tell your own story here?
That's what's really fascinating about the book coming out when it did, is that was not originally the intention. It wasn't when I started writing it, I didn't have in mind to combat deconversion stories. I had in mind to do more of a narrative style apologetic where you could see how I work through issues in the church. And one of the main issues I dealt with throughout my church experience was hypocrisy. But what ended up happening was that this book ended up releasing right at a time when there were these deconversion stories becoming so very popular and well known. So that was when I started to see basically what God was doing with this, was that it was sort of the anti-deconversion story where I had many questions about the behaviors of Christians and many questions about what I've been taught, but then ended up still believing in God, still believing Christianity was true. So it was more coincidental and more of like the project of maybe you could say of the Holy Spirit or on the timing of this book.
Yeah, I mean, it is interesting timing. But let's start before we get to kind of the struggle of kind of being a new believer and trying to make that, it was really, in your case, a geographic transition as much as a worldview transition. And I think all of that plays into it. But first, let's talk about your original conversion, because you grew up in a secular family, right? And a largely secular part of the country. What was the original kind of steps for you to come to faith in the first place?
My family actually had... They had left church when I was too young to remember. So they had made their decision when I was a very young child. And then they moved to a part of the country up to the Portland, Oregon area that wasn't, culturally Christian. So my upbringing was very non-influenced by Christianity, even though a lot of people like to say, oh, your name's Mary Jo, and And for a long time, I was in the South, so they thought I was born and raised basically in the church, but I wasn't. So my family, what they did raise me with, though it was outside of church, they raised me with the great beauty of the Pacific Northwest. They taught me to appreciate everything that was around me. I mean, my dad, huge fan of Carl Sagan. He loved cosmology. He also loved biology. So we watched a lot of nature and science shows, and they just really taught me appreciation for all that was around me. And I think what was happening to me, as I've pieced this together over the years, is that the profound beauty of the Northwest, the profound beauty of what I saw human beings could do, not only through the sciences, but also what I was seeing in nature. And then also my family loved the arts. So this profound beauty I saw in the arts, I think it started to, work on me as into what is all of this for? I began to wonder about this. Is this, we just live and die and that's all there is to life? Why does any of this matter? But at that point in my life, as I'm becoming an older teenager and beginning to think these sorts of things, I had a high school band director who was burdened for me. He was a Christian, and he was burdened for me particularly. And in my senior year of high school, he gave me a Bible as a graduation gift. And he said, when you go off to college, you're going to have hard questions. I hope you'll turn to this. And I read that Bible, and I greatly respected him. I actually became a public school music teacher myself. I taught band in the public schools. And I wasn't sure what I was going to find in the Bible. I wasn't sure, what all was going to be in there, but I really trusted him. I really respected him. And I had these questions about what is this all for? And what I found in the Bible was the source of all the beauty, and that there was an intelligence behind it, and it began to make sense to me. So in college, I'm kind of like the anti-statistic person.
There's a stunning detail here that I don't want people to miss. A few weeks ago on Breakpoint, we talked about that for the second year in a row, the Nobel Peace Prize went to an evangelical Ethiopian. And it's really one of those stunning things. And when you talk about the growth of Christianity in that whole region of the world, and then you start kind of going back, where did this start? Where did this start? Believe it or not, that whole region was Christian before Rome was declared Christian. Because, and we all know the story, right? God takes Philip, puts him beside an Ethiopian eunuch, and, you have the first converted Ethiopian in that whole region, and he's part of the court and so on. And then there's 2 or 3 other chapters to the story in the 400s and so on. There's something profoundly special about little acts of obedience and just taking the time to be burdened for somebody next to you and taking the time to actually say, hey, take a look at this book. I guess I just want to stop and talk about your band director here for just a second. How many, seriously, how many Christian school teachers or how many educators do you know that are educators because they had an educator in their life that said, you know what? You'd be a good teacher. And then it's like, oh man, yeah, that's who I am. And the same thing where you have here in this, I'm assuming it was a public school, right? Where this band teacher is like, hey, you're probably going to think about this at some point. Read the Bible, That's a very, very small act. That's something that everybody can do. I used to live in the South. This old dude at my church would say, it ain't rocket surgery, right? I mean, it's a very small little thing. But what a profound impact this band director had in your life. And now it's that ripple effect through your books, through your teaching, through the things that you do in publishing and teaching. I mean, I guess I just didn't want to skip over that. That's pretty special.
Yeah. Yeah. And I would emphasize, I did too. I didn't go into all the details like I do in the book, but he actually, this was the Beaverton public school system. And, we did not have Christianity in our school system. So we didn't have Christian stuff. They had winter concerts and things like that. They had sort of whitewashed out Christianity.
They had winter concerts before it was cool, right? I mean, everybody. You don't have to tell us what year that was, Mary Jo. That might be too personal of a question. But this was before even kind of the hyper secularization in the rest of the country. I mean, Portland. They've been doing it for a long time, right?
Yeah, he took a risk. So that's really cool. The point is that this band director was burdened for me and decided that burden to share Jesus with me in his way was more important than his job. And that was a really tough choice for him. He actually talks about this. He's gone on to be a college professor, and he teaches other people how to become band directors. And he talks about this incident with me and about the just how risky it was to share Jesus with me. So it is a small thing, like you're saying, but it had a big implication in many ways. And I really feel like he was just obedient to Christ, and that was more important to him than anything else, was his obedience in this situation.
Let me also highlight the other part that you just mentioned, because this is really what your book does so well, which is this combination of a story, and we know these conversion and deconversion stories are very popular. They're touching something, in our cultural psyche, and that's probably another conversation. But you mentioned the question of beauty, and one of the things I appreciate about your book is that it is this kind of really thoughtful apologetic and worldview analysis. So you're taking seriously the intellectual questions, while at the same time kind of talking about this existential crisis, and series of existential crises that you were going through. Beauty is one of those things, right? Beauty and design and elegance is something that is deeply appreciated in the scientific community. And at the same time, there's a worldview undergirding so much of our science that can't explain it. It's the old question, well, atheists can be moral too. But that's not the point. The point is, can atheism explain the existence of morality? And we're having this, and you were having this same kind of conversation in your own head about beauty, right? I mean, can atheists appreciate beauty? Yes, they do, but that's not the point. The point is, which worldview explains beauty the best? And so did you come up empty looking at atheism and saying, this idea of design and beauty and elegance and art, I see an explanation from Christianity that I don't see in atheism? Was that part of the journey?
Yeah, I think the idea of beauty comes in later in my journey, but I believe when I was younger, it was impacting me in ways that maybe I didn't quite understand, but I was looking for meaning. I was looking for meaning to the things I was experiencing. As I was a band kid and sitting inside of a performance where we're creating this beautiful work that, we're all experiencing. What is the meaning of this? I couldn't ground the meaning anywhere. And I think that's where, for me, atheism comes up short, is that it can't ground the purpose of this. It can't ground what this means. And that's very important for me as I'm dealing with hypocrisy in the church, as I'm dealing with, do I really want to be involved in Christianity? Do I really believe this? Is that, well, how do I know things have meaning? How do I know that these things I'm experiencing are real? And that was what I found lacking. There was a void in atheism for me. It was that grounding issue. And it wasn't just with beauty. It was on, how do I even trust my own reasoning ability? How do I know it's not just a survival mechanism, from natural selection has got us to this point where we have rationality, but I don't know if it's giving me truth or not. So it wasn't just beauty, but there were many areas that really I couldn't ground within an atheistic framework.
Hi, Shane Morris here again. We'll get back to John Stonestreet and Mary Jo Sharp in just a moment. But first, I wanted to let you know that during the month of January, we're offering a free subscription to World Magazine in exchange for your donation to the Colson Center. This offer includes 24 print issues, as well as full access to digital content from a trusted news source that's grounded in hope and biblical truth. You can give today and receive your subscription at breakpoint.org/January. That's breakpoint.org/January. Now back to John Stonestreet and Mary Jo Sharp, author of Why I Still Believe, a former atheist's reckoning with the bad reputation Christians give a good God.
Yeah. So the book really hits two things. First of all, the explanatory power of Christianity, but at the same time, the ways that Christians, fall short. I mean, you kind of think of the classic lines, Gandhi, I like Christ, I just don't like Christians, things like that. And I think Bertrand Russell had several other things like that to say. So you become a Christian. I'm kind of jumping forward into the story here. You come to faith. You go through a geographic move as well, having grown up in, the South and so on. There's a quirkiness to kind of quote-unquote Christian culture, being in the quote-unquote Bible Belt that many of us have experienced and many of us kind of complain about. And you identify kind of several parts of your story where you kind of feel like the church really didn't live up to, what it should.
Yeah, and I think that's what you're getting at, that cultural element that's in the church. I think what I was feeling, and I try to flesh this out over the course of the book, is that the church in some instances was putting culture ahead of Christ. So I was being asked to become a Southern evangelical woman before I was, people were really focusing on, do you know Jesus and are you getting to know God at a very deep level? And who is this God you profess? And how does that inform the person that you are? And that, because culture was being put first, I was seeing a lot of hypocrisy in the church. So I share some of the stories, like even my very first day in church as a brand new believer, I'm going into the service to say, hey, I've become a believer, to share this with the church and to be baptized, become a member of the church. And the very first thing I hear from the pastor's wife is that my clothing is inappropriate. I mean, as I'm walking into the sanctuary, she looks at me, gives me the once over and says, oh, honey, we need to find you better clothes.
Wow.
Yeah, these are the kinds of things that, are resonating. Actually, I'm hearing from people who are reading the book. They're like, yeah, I totally get that. That's the kinds of stuff that you see that and you say, these are the surface level issues that cause people to have distrust of the church, dislike of the church, because she's not putting Jesus in his proper place. Yeah. And emphasizing Jesus first. And that was what I saw in the church. And, time after time, especially in ministry, you get to see a lot of this in leadership. You get to see a lot of it in the laity as well, where they're professing Jesus and professing the standard of goodness that is God, but really giving themselves lots of license to do whatever vices they're involved with, whether it's pride or self-righteousness or whatever. So that was I sort of saw a disconnect, I guess you could say, between people who profess Jesus and their lives.
Yeah. I mean, here's the hard balance to take, right? Which is, well, let me give it a context here. I often tell young people, go study church history. If you have some doubts about this, study church history. And they're like, why? And I'm like, well, it's not because church history is clean. It's because church history is so messy that if Jesus isn't building this church, it wouldn't have had a chance, right? I mean, like there's no way this thing should. And we're part of that story. We're kind of creating the church that the next generation is going to complain about too. But at the same time, there's real sin. And, we should be quick to point out hypocrisy in the church because the fundamental doctrine after we're made in the image of God is that the fall's not just out there. The fall's, kind of runs down every human heart. So some people have looked at the hypocrisy of church, and that's kind of one of the features of these deconversion stories, and, basically gave up on the church, right? I want Jesus, but not the church. That's not a biblical option to have Jesus but not the church. So how do we balance that, kind of telling these stories and at the same time remembering, this is the bride of Christ? As one of my former bosses said, the church is God's plan A. There's not a plan B, It's like, love it or leave it. You got to have this. This is kind of part of the package deal. Does that make sense?
Yeah, this is such a great point because as I progress through my own story, I begin to realize naivety of my idealism going into the church. Because I didn't know church history, because I had no background in studying psychology, philosophy, and I didn't understand humans and that they can profess things and then not actually live by those things. And so like in dealing with this, I got to a point where I had to come to an understanding that just because people don't act like something is true, that doesn't make it untrue. That doesn't make it false. So, the hypocritical attitudes and behaviors of Christians cannot be the litmus test for the truth of Christianity, as painful as my own experiences were. So I had to eventually figure out, you got to go find out whether this is true or not, that's the main thing. And that's what I did. And as I started studying, as I get deeper into the nature of God, you find out things like, well, God himself is a community. Right? You have the community of the Trinity. And when his creation is made in his image, so we are made for community. And that's one of the things I explore is that in the book is that, I felt marginalized. Yes, I felt upset with the church. So now what? What am I going to do? Because I have come to the point where I understand that I am made for community. I'm made to be in this mess of life with other people. And there are things that I learn by engaging with other people that I don't learn in isolation. So I got to the point, John, where I was like, what do I do? Did Jesus teach on anything about this? Of course he did. He taught it in the Sermon on the Mount. In Luke 6, he says that we're to do good to those who are not doing good to us, right? That we're to do unto others as we want others to do unto us. And that, I think Jesus is so brilliant here because he knows, I mean, obviously he's brilliant, but he knows that we're going to experience that people are not going to do the right things to us. Now, what are we going to do? And that's his own flock, right? That's the church. So it's not just the church, but it definitely includes the church. And that's, he died for us so that we could be in relationship with him. And yet he's saying, do unto others as you want others to do unto you. So I think this is a real important point for our cultural moment, in that the going mantra is that if people don't agree with you, they're haters. So just push them out of your life, right? Don't listen to the haters, get rid of people, everybody. So there's this idea that everybody who doesn't agree with you should be removed. And this is antithetical to the teaching of Christ. So you have to be smart about it. You don't just push yourself into relationships that are abusive or verbally abusive or whatever. You got to be smart about it. But at the same time, remember, he said to do good to those who are your enemies. Do good to those who aren't doing good to you. You don't just push everybody out. And that was real important for me to learn about. I need to find a way to engage with the church that is a healthier way to engage with her, realizing that all human beings are fallen and will let me down at some point, just like I will let them down at some point.
Yeah. Well, look, I really think, Mary Jo, that, you kind of identified here. I think these are two real strengths of your book. I mean, the first is acknowledging that there's plenty of skeletons in the closet. There's plenty of, blemishes. There's one of the great hymns that talks about, the bride of Christ being battered and ugly at times, that sort of thing. But the truthfulness of Christianity has to be judged on the truthfulness of Christianity. I mean, it's like when the disciples, are asked by Jesus after, the multitudes get frustrated and walk away, are you going to leave too? And he's like, no, you've got the words of eternal life. There's not another option. And I think, the problem of evil, the problem of hypocrisy, the problem of human behavior, the question of things like beauty and meaning, we often throw that at Christianity, like you've got to prove yourself here, as if all the other worldviews don't have to answer the same questions. And so kind of bringing that debate up, I think, is a real telling the story of your experience, but bringing the debate up above your experience is one of the real strengths of this book, Mary Jo. And then the second one is, the church is frustrating for a lot of us, but we've got to stay at the table. And your invitation for Christians to stay at the table of the church, I think, is a really, really important one, even while, acknowledging, that there are serious issues here. The other thing that I think the book does really well, Mary Jo, is talk about the role of doubt and faith. And that's something that you have done in other works as well. It's been a part of some of your Sunday school materials, small group materials that you've produced. Talk a little bit about that. What have you learned about doubt? Oftentimes growing up in kind of the Christian bubble, as I did, you would get the impression that, when you ask these tough questions, you're a troublemaker, right? Doubting is sinning. And you have a different take on that. And I think it's an important one.
Yeah. And that's, when you say growing up in the church, you saw that sort of idea that doubt was, equivalent to sinning. So in the book, I kind of talk about that first, that, there is this sort of feeling within the church that doubt might be an enemy of faith. So I discussed that, but I said, rather what I've learned is doubt might just be an instructive and natural part of maturing in Christ, maturing in your faith. So kind of like it's similar to leaving behind your childhood trust in your parents for a more adult approach to them. You don't just believe everything your parents tell you anymore. Whereas when you're a child, when you're young, you just trust them because you don't know any different. I compare that to the same thing in Christianity. Like when you become a new believer, you tend to trust and believe what people are telling you. But you wouldn't want to stay in your youthful Christian beliefs, right? You're supposed to. And Paul actually encourages us over and over in the New Testament to move on from those youthful ideas into a more mature approach. And so doubt can be something that is part of the maturing process of becoming an older believer in God, and then help pass that along to other people. Of course, you're going to have questions because you're not God. You don't have all the knowledge that there is to have. So as a finite being with a finite mind, you have questions because you don't know everything. This is natural. This is part of growing up. So I try to approach it that way. And then also the other sort of flavor I bring to the doubt issue is that, remember, when we doubt God, he's a person. And so there's some element of doubt as being relational. And that was part of my doubt, was that as I distrusted persons, as I distrusted the people in the church, so the church, I didn't realize I was transferring that over to God, because he is also a person. So at the end of the day, if I get all these arguments for God's existence, I'm not just gaining knowledge and getting a set of facts so I can say, look at that. This is the fact, right? God exists. I'm, at the end of the day, coming into relationship with a person. And so there's a very different end result to the doubting process in Christianity.
Yeah. There's so much more we could talk about. We're out of time. I mean, one thing that I think a lot of people have struggled with is the issue of evil and suffering. And one of the things I really appreciate is that personal way you address that issue, because a lot of times we like to throw Romans 8:28 bombs, over the safe, fence, to people who are suffering. But, kind of we deal with this issue as if it doesn't really hurt. And I really appreciated how you handled that. I wish we had time to go into it, but we don't. My guest today has been Mary Jo Sharp, a former atheist, now professor of apologetics, assistant professor to be precise, at Houston Baptist University, the founder and director of Confident Christianity Apologetics, and the author of this book, Why I Still Believe. I think this is a great book, given the popularity of deconversion narratives and so on that are hitting so many teens and 20-somethings. I think this is a really powerful book, particularly for that age demographic, Mary Jo. So thanks for writing it. I think it's great, and congratulations on it, and thanks for being a guest today and telling us a little bit about it on the Breakpoint podcast.
Hey, John. It's good to be on the show and good to catch up with you.
Thanks for listening to the Breakpoint podcast. Come to our online bookstore at breakpoint.org to get your copy of Mary Jo Sharp's new book, Why I Still Believe, a former atheist's reckoning with the bad reputation Christians give a good God. And remember, you can get a 1-year subscription to World Magazine with your gift to Breakpoint and the Colson Center during the month of January. Just come to breakpoint.org/January for more details. That's breakpoint.org/January. For the Colson Center, I'm Shane Morris.